A Manifestation of Delphiniums. A story by Sarah Jane Mackenzie. Episode 5. Tony had run a software company, though he had not himself known much about computing. He had provided the rent for the office and all the desks and chairs, and done the initial hiring of people he had guessed might know something about computing. His gamble had paid off, and he had made a significant sum of money. When there had at one point been a problem, he had delegated the problem into a job of hiring a new computing expert to solve the problem, and had been very careful to spend most of his own time away from the office, so enabling most of the staff there to assume that he was, in fact, a computing expert himself, who nevertheless was too busy with the larger field to pay too much attention to what was going on the outskirts of Doncaster, which was where the office had been located. He had got his original start-up money on his mother's death as an inheritance. He had been surprised by that because he had always been led to think, particularly also regarding some of the extremities of poverty his family had seemed to be in during his childhood, that she did not have a significant amount of money. But it turned out she had, by the time she died, amassed quite a fortune through playing the stocks and shares market. That was the explanation the solicitor had given him, at any rate, and he was not one to look a gift horse in the mouth when he needed cheering up, because he had felt deeply saddened by the thought of having neither of his parents still in the world to comfort him or argue with, and at times his mother had been a very lovely, lively and interesting lady. He got round to looking up Carl Linnaeus on the computer and dived into an article on Wikipedia, but having skimmed most of it, he could not find himself agreeing with Dave that Linnaeus seemed to have originated a rational system of categorization. In fact, it was quite apparent to him, if the info was correct, that there were deep contradictions apparent in the summary it gave. If Linnaeus had not believed in such a fossil as the dragon one, what was he doing arranging things into a set of categories that even included monsters? Had he himself actually believed at the time that he'd been lying to the Catholic Church when he made out the worrying dragon fossil was a fake and glued up bits of other remnants? Or was it the classification system that was somehow meant to be compensatory to those who still held deep superstitions in order to avoid any potential comeback from the Church and to try and protect his own skin? The poached eggs had been good. It had turned out that the egg timer in the drawer was actually more use at timing poached eggs than it had been for soft-boiled eggs. So he decided to experiment some more, and that evening for dinner, instead of thinking he ought to abandon pasta because of the boiling time, he tried putting a lid which he found at the back of a cupboard in the kitchen, all covered with cobwebs initially, as even he had noticed Julie had never ever bothered with pan lids when she had been cooking, and found that the water heated up significantly quicker on the hob, and that keeping the lid on, which had an eye-hole engineered into it to let out the steam, meant that the pasta cooked in very little time at all. He had not any pesto in the cupboard, and considered eating the pasta with salt and vinegar, as one would ordinarily have accepted chips, but then found a jar of mint sauce, and thought he would try using that instead of pesto as the nearest thing this country might get to being self-proficient, as he himself, though he had barely ever used it, had some mint growing successfully in his lovely garden. It was lovely. It helped him feel much better. He was glad he had made it back home from the pub alive, and without having been stopped by the police. The more he thought about it, however, and he had been thinking about this too recently as another thought that haunted him next to the dinosaur one, and haunted him as a related thought in many respects. Just because you had managed to get away with something hundreds of times, would it inevitably mean it was all right to do it? Or that even with something that did not have any aura of wickedness to it at all, that it was safe? Would it inevitably mean that because it had been okay to do 100 times would it inevitably mean that because it had been okay to do something 100 times, on the 101st time it might also be okay? He had just felt better a moment ago, and that had been so good, and he had been so grateful for the pasta and mint, but now he was already feeling chewed up again by his own worries. It would make him feel better if he went to see Julie tomorrow. For all he knew, he might be developing dementia too.